We have kind of already seen in previous section that React is a JavaScript library that renders some HTML onto the web page. The way we write code in React is through components that ultimately renders our views, or in other words HTML onto the UI. We write multiple React components and we compose them together by composing the smaller components inside bigger components. This way we can build several components and put them together in a nice and easy way to make bigger web applications. So far, we have just created some React elements of primitive types like h1 tag, li tag, and ul tag. That does the same thing as of our corresponding HTML tags. In this section, we are going to take a look at how we can create our own custom or user-defined components. To start with, let's remove some no longer needed code. Let's remove our unordered list of JSX code which we have written in the previous section. Let's also remove its HTML counterpart there at the top. Our purpose in writing this was to showcase the similarity in appearance between JSX and HTML code. And I'm gonna uncomment my app variable in JSX code over here. Okay, let's save it. Fine. We'll come to the point now. How can we create a React component? The answer is just define a function that returns some JSX or React elements. That's all. Let me define the component. I'm gonna define a function by name component, and it's a function. In order to be a component, it has to return some JSX code. So I'm gonna copy my hello world heading over here in JSX and I'm gonna paste it inside my return statement. Okay, this JSX code will ultimately get transpiled to React.createElement call. So ideally, we are returning a React element of type h1 from our component function. If you observe, previously we have rendered hello world heading onto the web page like this, where app equal to hello world in JSX. It's also a React element of type h1 with same content or children as hello world. So you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between the app variable that stored h1 element and the component that returns h1 element from a function? Before I explain the difference between app and the component, I want you to take a look at some piece of code which I'll try on the console and we'll see what's the difference between the two. Let's head over to the console. Let me write the two code snippets. So I'm going to define a variable by name age and set it to value 10. Similarly, I'm going to define a function by name getAge, and inside it, it will contain a variable by name age. Again, its value will be 10, and I'm going to return age variable inside that function. Okay. So, and I'm going to do age equal to getAge function call, and it's true. Well, even though both of them returns the same result, the significant difference between them is first statement is just a variable that stores some value, but the second statement is a function that returns some value. We know that a function is much more flexible in comparison to just storing data inside a variable, because function can take input and perform some operations before returning the output, whereas variable that stores some data is just a plain dump. All it can do is to contain some static information at a time, but can't perform any logic on the data it contains. Similarly, the difference between our variable app and component is also the same as of difference between a variable that stores some data and a function. Here, variable app stores only the React element created using React.createElement, but our component is a function that returns a React element. Since component is a function, it can accept arguments as input and can perform some logic before finally returning a React element, which makes the component much more flexible and reusable than the variable that stores a React element. We'll take a look at how to pass arguments to the component in a moment, but before we do that, let's first try to render our component to the React DOM. I'm going to copy this portion of code, comment it out and paste it down right over there. Okay, as before, I'm going to pass component to the render method as first argument. I'm not going to touch the second argument, through which we pass the target DOM node here. Okay, let's save it and head on to our browser to check the output. And we got an error. It says React DOM.render invalid component element. Instead of passing a class like foo, pass React.createElement foo or some JSX foo. Okay, let's try to understand the error. Error says that instead of passing a class, or you can assume some function foo, we need to pass a React element or some JSX code. That is, the first argument that React DOM.render accepts should be a React element. Our component is not a React element here, but it's a function that returns some React element through JSX code. And the fix to this is, since component will return JSX, React allows us to use React.createElement over our component. In other words, we can produce a React element from our component function by saying React.createElement and by passing component to it as argument. That's all. Let's save it, and now everything should work fine. Let's check on the browser. This time we got our intended output hello world displayed on the web page. So we have successfully created and rendered our first React component on the web page. This component function over here is termed as a functional component. Since it's a function and returning some JSX makes it a component, so a functional component. Okay, if you remember our earlier discussion on JSX, we mentioned that the whole point of JSX is not having to write React.createElement every time whenever we want to create a React element. Instead, we can use JSX, which is a HTML-like syntax. So I'll be writing this React.createElement in JSX. Okay, let me copy this portion of code, comment it out and paste it over there right at that bottom. Okay, and I'm gonna remove this line since I will be writing my component in JSX like this. That's all. So this code will eventually transpile to React.createElement only. So both these lines are identical, this one and this one. To prove this, let's save it and check the output on the web page. It's the same hello world heading again, right? So this proves that both these statements are identical. Okay, we have already seen two ways to render our component. One using React.createElement and taking component as argument, and the other using component in JSX. There is also another way which we can write this. We can remove this closing tag over here and combine it with the opening tag itself, on condition that we shouldn't have any children inside it. Let me write what I'm saying. Let me copy this portion of code, comment it out, paste it down over there, and I can simply remove the closing tag and give it a space over here in the opening tag and keep a backslash. That's all. This is a self-closing JSX tag, and we usually write like this if we don't have anything to put inside the opening and closing tags of our component in JSX code. Closing tag is compulsory in JSX, unlike in HTML where some tags doesn't need to be closed like link tag. Even in this case, this code over here will eventually get transpiled to React.createElement and component as argument. Let's check the output for this on the browser. Let's just save it if it's not saved and head over to our browser. It's the same hello world heading again. So all these lines of code, which is React.createElement and taking component as argument, and component in opening and closing tags of JSX, and self-closing tag of component in JSX are identical. Okay, we are definitely going to do more research on React elements in much more depth in the later sections of this course. But first, we need to understand some of the principles and terminologies in React. We have to first create some components, use them to build our application, and progressively dive deeper into React internals. As of now, it suffices to say that React components return some JSX that are just React elements, and React DOM.render accepts that React element of type component and render it to the DOM. That's all. Alright, if you have noticed so far, our React component has been returning some kind of constant data, which doesn't make it more reusable. What we really want is to be able to pass some data from outside to our component. Let's say we want to pass a greeting message like hello world or hey there to the component as argument, just like we pass arguments to the function. In React, we call the arguments that we pass to a component as props. Let's discuss on props in our next section. Before we move on, let's quickly take a look at this. Notice that I have given the name of the component with first letter as capital. This is not a coincidence. For app variable over here, which is a React element, we can make the first letter of its name as small as well and pass it to the render method. It doesn't make any difference and it works fine. Let me go ahead and show it. I'm going to change it to small a over here, and let me comment out this code, and let me uncomment this portion of code, and I'm going to change it to small a over here also. Okay, let's save it and head back to our browser. We can see the same hello world heading displayed successfully. Okay, but in case of components, we have to keep the first letter of its name as capital only. And the reason behind this is, if you notice how we rendered hello world using React.createElement, we'll see its first argument is a string, which is a type of the element, which is in our case h1. This is a JSX form of it, and both are identical, since after transpilation, this JSX code is going to get converted into the same as of here. So whenever we need to render a DOM node like h1, div, ul, li, etc., we always need to put it in string codes in create element calls first argument. Okay, We'll observe functional component code in JSX now. Be it this one with opening and closing tags or this one with self-closing tag, both the forms are going to get converted into React.createElement with component as argument, but without quotes. This difference is the key here. The way the argument is written, whether it's in string quotes or not, serve as a means to convey React which type of element it is, whether it's a native element or user-defined component. And then React will parse it accordingly. Now, since we are writing code in JSX and we know it's going to be transpiled or converted to React.createElement call, how can our transpiler is going to know whether it's a native DOM element or our own component? We are not adding anything extra over here to indicate it. Hence, there comes the importance of capitalization of first letter name. When passing it as an argument to createElement call, our transpiler wraps it in string quotes when the name is not capitalized, like this. Whereas it won't keep it in quotes if the name is capitalized, like this. So capitalization of name's first letter is just to make our transpiler distinguish between the DOM nodes and our own components. That's all. To be more clear, let's try to understand this with code demonstration. Let's see what happens if we keep our component name's first letter as small. I'm going to change it as small c, and let's comment out this portion of code. And let's uncomment this portion of code since we'll be working with component as of now, and let's change it to small c. Okay, let's save it and head back to our browser, and we can't see anything on the web page. I'm going to refresh it again. Still we couldn't able to see anything. It's because if we make first letter of our component as small, this code in JSX gets transpiled to, let me write it in comments. So it gets transpiled to like this, React.createElement with component in string quotes. And being in string quotes makes React to parse it as a native DOM element like h1, div, etc. But since it couldn't able to find any match to it among the native DOM elements, it simply didn't display anything on the web page. That's why we should always define the first letter of our user-defined component names capitalized if we are going to use JSX. If we don't use JSX or instead prefer to use createElement directly, then there is no restriction of capitalizing the name, because what React cares is whether the first argument is in quotes or not. So we can pass our component without mentioning it in quotes, and it's perfectly fine. Let's check that also. I'm going to remove this code and just put our component not in quotes like this. And let's put a comma over here. Let's save it and head back to our browser. We can get to see our hello world heading back again on the web page. Alright, this ends our demonstration. Since we are using JSX, I'm going to revert back to the first letter of my component name as capital. And should be capital C. Okay, and let's put this also in JSX like this. Perfect. Let's check the output now once. Okay, everything is fine. To wrap our discussion, in this video we have created our first React component, which is a functional component since it's a function returning some JSX, and we have seen three ways of rendering it onto the DOM. One using React.createElement method, second using opening and closing tags of JSX, and the other using self-closing tag in JSX. Remember, we can write using self-closing tag only when we don't have any children inside the opening and closing tags of our component. Finally, we get to know that we need to always capitalize the first letter of our custom component names so that our transpiler will decide whether to put them in quotes or not when passing them as argument to createElement method. Alright, let's move on.